Hey everybody. I was told by my fellows in the dojo that without a thumbnail or a flashy title or some video editing or something, any instructive video I made like this would just hurt our channel. But I made a ton of videos that are just sitting around in the queue waiting for somebody to slap a stupid thumbnail on them. You know, for weeks, nobody's getting to learn from these videos because they're awaiting a thumbnail. So I'm going to skip the process and just make this video and post this video. So, you know, go ahead and trash our channel if you want because it's missing a thumbnail. But this lesson that I have ready for you today is extremely instructive and I think not insanely difficult. Should be accessible to all kinds of players. You don't need to play the Sicilian with white or black for it to be worthwhile to learn or understand something about it, right? Like I don't play the King's Indian defense as black, or I didn't for many years. Okay, now I play anything, but for many years I didn't play the King's Indian defense as black, but I still looked at a couple great King's Indian defense games and I understood that, you know, black could play f5, f4 and start a kingside attack. You know, I understood that the dark squares could become weak for white after a black exchange sack of the rook for the dark squared bishop. Like, it's good to have a few ideas for understanding chess. So this video is intended for anybody in the range from 1200 up to 2200 FIDE. And I'm going to show you the game from which the single game from which I learned the most about playing the Open Sicilian with either color. And knowing this one game, which I easily kept in mind. I didn't make like an effort to memorize it, but I memorized it. Knowing this one game was a huge benefit for me, and I think it will be for all of you as well. So it's a Nxd4 Sicilian. It was played by Bobby Fischer in 1970 in the interzonal against Rubinetti, but essentially for those of you who know some of your Fischer history, in 1970 basically anybody he played suddenly transformed into NN, right? This is the start of a 2-year reign of terror where he goes from arguably, you know, maybe the best player in the world and, you know, certainly the challenger one would like to see play a world title match to somebody who's more than 100 points stronger than anyone else in the world. You know, and you could argue 150, 200 points stronger than anybody else in the world. So here it is. Fischer was famous for playing 6 bishop c4 against the Nxd4. Again, what you're going to learn here applies to other variations. It applies to the bishop g5 Nxd4. It applies to the classical Sicilian. It applies to the Scheveningen. You know, it doesn't apply to absolutely every single kind of Open Sicilian. There are some positional kinds of Open Sicilians where white plays in a more restrained way. But this applies to any Sicilian where white really commits to the development lead and aggressive play. Okay. So e6, Fischer moved back here, b5, castles, bishop to b7. Now, I think this move is officially some kind of theoretical inaccuracy. When I first encountered this move, I was a kid. I had limited knowledge and understanding, both knowledge and understanding of you know, how to play the opening as well as the theory behind it. So my opponent played bishop b7, and I demonstrated a very, very crude and rudimentary idea against the Nxd4 and Open Sicilian. So I'm going to take you on a detour from our first detour from Fischer Rubinetti here, and I'm going to show you a game I played as a 13-year-old in a junior high school championship for California. And what I played was bishop takes e6. And you can take on e6 with the knight or the bishop in general in the Sicilian. Trade a piece for 2 pawns. And in general, prevent your opponent from castling. Now, just stated like that, it sounds like an interesting proposal where you wouldn't immediately be certain if it is a good idea or a bad idea, right? A piece for 2 pawns and prevent the opponent from castling. Well, yeah, tell me more, right? I haven't yet made up my mind on this thing. Note that in general in the Open Sicilian, white tends to get ahead in development, and black tends to have this central structure, which is considered fairly solid. Like there's no easy way for white to just walk through the pawns without sacrifices, right? And it looks like, you know, how do you apply pressure? If you go f4, f5, black plays e5. If you try to play e5 yourself, yeah, that's another idea you can try to do sometimes to get some aggression started in this opening. But very often black can just play knight d7 or knight d5 or trade once and then play there. So it's not easy to pry the center open and start an attack using your extra time. And so one of the important tools in white's belt, critical tool, is the idea that you can make some small material sacrifice to break up this pawn center, which is famously, you know, without weakness, very solid pawn center, but, you know, come crashing through in one move and you'll see that suddenly everything is open and loose. So I played this move. In this position, it's not an amazing move, but we'll continue with it. The knight comes here. The queen's going to want to move. D7 and C8 are generally the best moves for the queen, but, you know, anywhere that doesn't hang her could be considered. My opponent played queen d7. And now an important detail in these positions, you're not looking to trade off your opponent's undeveloped piece. That would be absolute trash. You're also not generally looking to, after you play your sacrifice, simply retreat the knight. At this point, if you just retreat your knight, notice you didn't fully prevent castling, right? Once your knight comes back, your opponent can play bishop e7, and they're ready to castle. So a very, very important detail is you almost always follow up a bishop sack on e6 with the move knight d5, leaving the knight on e6 hanging. And the two knights have this connection to the c7 square that unites them, right? And a united purpose makes a strong team. So black's unable to capture the knight on e6, and that's kind of the crux of the bishop sacrifice on e6. And in this game, my opponent trades to stop one of the knights from landing on c7. It's not forced, but this will frequently happen. And then you see the knight is now locked in, and so black's lack of castling is also similarly locked in. This pawn may look slightly weak, and you may question the support of these pieces, but generally, if black doesn't develop these pieces, it's going to be crazy to start trying to win another pawn here without any more support or development, right? I mean, queen takes d5, there's going to be knight c7 check. Knight takes d5, there will be queen takes d5 followed by knight c7 check. Plus it's white's move, and white can, you know, do something, set something up, you know, play rook e1, play bishop g5, going after the knight while black can't yet take. Generally, you know, black's gonna have to struggle to untangle some pieces in this position. You know, the knight is going to be a little slow in this version with the queen here versus here. Black played king f7. I played g4. And this position shouldn't be that great necessarily for white. It's probably playable. I think h6 was played and is forced. This is a very, very controversial and interesting move. Again, you know, obvious moves would be rook e1 or bishop e3 or bishop g5 or queen d3. Anything involving developing these pieces. Honestly, even b3 to play c4 makes some sense to me, locking in your whole structure and your knight on e6 and saying you've got time because black's going to be awkward for a while. But g4 is a non-trivial move. And after h6, f4, h5, g5, my opponent gave a check over here and played knight g4, and I played queen e2 covering this. And I eventually went on to win this game. An interesting thing that's going on here is if black plays g6, then f5 tears open the king. If black doesn't play g6, then white could play f5, g6 themselves and really bury the rook on h8 for the entire game. So it's a very interesting concept. And I think, it's interesting. It's an interesting concept. Now, after I played this game, I talked to my chess teacher, Robert Haynes, and he told me, he was very complimentary and told me that this move here, G4, had once been played by a Soviet master against another Soviet master and had been given an exclam by a grandmaster commentator. So this was the first, to my mind, as a kid back then. Now you all have computer game reviews giving you 3 exclams after every game you play, like, this move plays mate in 1, congratulations. But for me, this was the first, like, exclam that I had earned. The first real exclam of my entire chess career. I felt fantastically about it. So that was really exciting. At the same time, Robert told me that bishop takes e6 is not the most powerful here, and that this is an example of a position where the threat could be stronger than the execution, and that I should go check out how Bobby Fischer had played this position. And that's when I was introduced to the game Fischer-Rubinetti and the move rook to e1. So bishop takes e6, fe6, knight e6, this position is controversial. It's playable. It's okay for white, but not necessarily convincing. What Fischer played was rook e1, and here's the really important thing to recognize about this position. Black can't play bishop e7, the move that prepares castling. This is the important point here with rook e1. You can now play bishop e6, pawn takes e6, knight takes e6, and win a third pawn. And not only that, but the king is kind of, headed to this area here with just no pawn cover. And so the first thing I learned here from Fischer was a road sign, right? The road sign is you can randomly take on e6 here, and the evaluation is unclear, playable. Maybe a small edge for white, in line with other openings. But this move is a mistake because it weakens e6, because black's not in a position to take on e4, and not because you take on e6 right away, but because the threat of taking over e6 will hang over black. And then the other evaluation roadmap that I was given, or signpost, sorry, was that this position here is simply good for white. 3 pawns instead of 2. That was the other piece of information I had, right? So if you take on e6 when you're getting 2 pawns, it's unclear. If you take on e6 where you're getting 3 pawns like this, it's good for white. Now, there can be exceptions, right? Like there might be some position where black has an immediate counterattack against g2, or an immediate knight takes e4, knight takes e4, queen f5. You have to check. You have to check this move in positions like this and make sure that it's not some kind of a strong tactic for black. In this position, I think bishop h6 just wins immediately for white by forcing queen h5 or queen g4 with check, and then you can take the piece freely because your knight's defended, right? So something like check here, check here, and you take the piece. Right, so here knight e4 doesn't work, but the point is, the signpost is if there's nothing going on here, white now has the advantage with 3 pawns and, space and the black king denuded for the piece. But then, against the signpost, you have to check every specific position. Is there some detail that favors white or black here compared to what my signpost evaluation is, right? Same thing for just sacking on e6 right away. You have to ask yourself, is there some specific reason why this would be more good for white or black than my signpost position when I see different versions of this come up in other games, right? So bishop b7, rook e1, okay, so on with the Fischer game, Rubinetti plays knight b7 to avoid bishop takes e6, and Fischer develops the bishop on g5, and still bishop e7, bishop e6. You can check if there's some detail that makes that position better for black than normal, but no. White's still staying ahead in development, still ready to make that sack. There's no tactical detail to save black yet. So Rubinetti played h6, kicking the bishop. Bobby keeps the bishop on h4. And still, bishop e7, you can take on e6. The other line that exists for black in these positions, which I'll show you after the Fischer game, is queen to b6. And that's a move that's been played a couple times later on in chess history after this Fischer game. So for now, you're going to see, what else is black going to do from this position if they can't play bishop e7, right? Just maybe one other thing they could do, which is g5, bishop here, and then just accept this crazy weakness. That would be a risky modern way to play, reminiscent of bishop e3, knight g4 in the Najdorf, and there are more and more Najdorf lines where black tries h6, g5. Maybe it could be of some interest. Rubinetti played knight c5, and now Fischer plays an absolutely devastating move. Now, in general, in the Sicilian, these are maybe the two most famous kinds of sacrifices in the Sicilian that I'm talking about today: taking on e6 and plopping a knight on d5. If you've never seen the plop a piece on d5 idea, it's takes, you give a check, and you send their king to d7 or d8, because if bishop e7, knight f5, and you win your piece. Okay, so plopping a piece on d5 like this is sort of like the second most famous or is one of the two most famous sacrifices in the Open Sicilian, I would say. Some of you who are familiar with it will even know that once you've plopped one piece, if your opponent's afraid to take it, you can plop the other piece on f5 next, right? So if your opponent's like, oh, I can't take it, I'll hunker down, then you put the next one here, and it gets harder and harder to take either one as they just start hanging out on these squares. So that's an example of how using energy and sacrifices, you can build up pressure against your opponent in the face of their sort of supposedly perfect solid center with central control. It's like, well, if they actually take your stuff, then the center blows open and you get a different kind of game. But in this position, Fischer plays a variation on that knight d5, which is bishop d5. It's a scintillating move. It's a fantastic move. And it's also a fairly powerful and forcing move, because this move has a slightly unusual threat of b4. b4 isn't played so often in the Open Sicilian by white by reason of black's usually pressuring you on the c file. So moving your b pawn is always weakening the file next to the pawn you move, right? So you give up control of c3 and c4 when you push the b pawn. So it's very rare to see people move their b pawns in the Open Sicilian, but that's the threat here, is b4 kicking the knight that defends the bishop on b7. So in the game, black takes, gets checked, bishop e7, there's knight f5, sort of very standard for Open Sicilians, right? And you lose back your piece, you're still down a pawn, white gets into e7. If you castle like this, for example, you see more damage can come into your king's position. So it's not just like, oh, white sacked a piece, we can give a piece back. It is a very important element in the Open Sicilian that that when somebody has sacrificed a piece against you, you can give the piece back as ballast, but you can't do it totally flippantly, right? You have to assess it fairly precisely, right? So in this case, white sacked a piece for a pawn. That means you can't sack a full piece back and just be down a pawn. You also have to actually like the position you're getting from your sacrifice back and not think that it's a terrible position. So, okay. So let's take back let's take back this bishop e7 move, giving back the piece. Rubinetti plays king d7, and now a beautiful move from Bobby, b4 attacking the knight anyway. Its retreat square has been taken away by the king. Other retreat square here. This is the detail that makes the d5 sack good here. If Bobby didn't have that, he would have one pawn for the piece and the king wandering through the center. That's not necessarily good enough. In fact, I think without the b4 move, I really doubt that white would have enough here for the sacrifice. There's many versions of this kind of position where the black king just kind of waltzes over to b8 or a7 even, and eventually you could play bishop e7, rook e8, or you can untangle with g5. There's many, I mean, this has been played many times, and white normally needs something more than a single pawn, and the king being in the middle. There needs to be some other juice. And in this case, the other juice is this b4 move. It traps this knight. Knight has to go to a4. Bobby trades it, plays c4, and he's going to pick up a second pawn on a4, but also he's gotten a pawn mass rolling towards the black king. So now suddenly, you know, well, the king doesn't look very safe here because c5, c6 is coming from this side, right? The king also, if it comes this way, white's going to have c5 and b5 as pawn breaks, trying to get at the king. So now it's 2 pawns for the piece plus, you know, very, very flexible pawn mass. So the 2 pawns that white has are of good quality, and black's in a lot of danger. Okay. Black moves the king out of the way in advance of queen a4. Queen a4 is played anyway. Queen d7, offering the queen trade, and white is simply going to retreat. And this is a very important point about the importance of time in these sacrificial positions, right? Do you have enough to play retreating moves at time, consolidating moves, and build like a second wave to your attack or your compensation? Or are you in a situation where you can only go forward, 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 right? So if you remember the first example of my childhood sacrifice, right, of bishop e6 here, in this position I said if white's just backing up, it's not enough, right? We haven't done enough damage to black's position. They play bishop e7, they castle, and we've got 2 pawns against a piece. We're just sort of more or less losing 2 pawns against a bishop, right? So, So here, it's important that white has that detail of knight d5, not backing up and keeping that position, right? Compare that to the Fischer game. Here, he already has enough between the 2 pawns. White had 2 pawns in another scenario, right? But the 2 pawns plus the black king position. The king already can't castle, and white already has a powerful plan to roll the pawns on the queen side, wherever the king positions itself on the queen side. So in Fischer's case, he has the time to play a retreating move. He knows he already has enough play on the board, and that it's not 100% tempo based, right? There's multiple plans. You could play b5, a5, knight c6, plop that knight in there. Ouch. You could play c5, trying to blow open this area, right? Those are probably the 2 main ideas from here, but not the only ones. You can also go a4, a5 to make this pawn a hook, and then play b5, and be sure to trade off a pawn and open up a file that way. So he's got enough juice here to play a retreating move. Rubinetti is going to squirm a little bit, g5, bishop g3, knight h5, try and pick up this piece, and Bobby's going to calculate a little precision here and see that he can play c5, hanging the pawn on d5, just as post was asking about. Yes, when we play c5, this pawn will hang. Depending how much time you have, you know, you could play a move like rook c1, making it even harder for black to take your pawn on d5 after the sack, or you could put a rook on d1 and protect the pawn on d5 in advance of trying to play c5. In this case, Bobby plays c5, hanging both pawns, honestly, right? Because black's bishop's on c5. And black's going to take the pawn, but let me just quickly point out one little detail. Black doesn't have time to get rid of this bishop because you don't have to recapture as white. The knight has no further, you know, violent moves of any value. You can play c6 first, an in-between move, hitting the queen, trapping the bishop. Queen moves wherever it wants to, and then you recapture the knight. So, so black doesn't have time to take the bishop. Black takes. Now, you see the bishop really cutting off the king's squares. And again, no time to take the bishop because of c6. Right? So that's a very, very powerful threat. No time to play bishop c5 either because rook c1. The king can't even get out of here. If you take here, then again, it's an in-between move, right? Takes with check, and then recapture the piece. So, in the game, black played queen d5. By the way, I remember this game completely, but an interesting thing about this game is, you know, when I play it over again, you know, 3 years later or 4 years later from the last time I've played it over, when I show it to somebody new, I always remember the moves, but I forget, you know, the calculations of why black can or can't take on d5. Or, I mean, I know black can't take on d5, but I forget exactly why they can't take with the queen or the bishop, right? And I have to refigure it out for myself every time. But because I've actually understood the game, it's always easy to figure it out again. Right? So that's the nice part, okay? So queen d5 is what's played in the game. And here it's rook e8 check. King's got no squares except d7. Queen a4 check. King's got nowhere to go. Bishop blocks, and we take. So now if the queen would take, well, we can just, you know, check the king off of defending the queen, right? Rook d1 check, and then something like this, and here. And, you know, white's up a queen and giving checkmate. So the other option would be to take the rook. Oh, sorry. I didn't say taking this way, so I'll just say real quick, knight b4 wins the queen. Right? So we're going to take with the king. Now against knight b4, there would be queen d7, saving the queen from the knight. So here we can go rook e1 check, for example. And if the king goes to d7, then knight b4 will win the queen again. So now the bishop has to block. Now we can take here with check, attacking the queen. Queen has to come here. And now you can sort of wreck black however you please. I mean, c6, c7 should win. Whatever, I'll just play one variation for you that I randomly choose. The king has to keep defending the queen. Queen check, king here, knight here. Something kind of boring and simple, right? But winning a queen and a couple moves. Yeah, pretty easy to reconstruct when you have a sense of the idea. So now let's look at bishop takes d5 for a moment. And I'm showing you this not so you memorize the variations, but because I think having figured out the variations teaches you to play this in the future, a similar game like this, right? You have to do a couple little calculations like what Fischer would have done at the time, and that gets you that insight into what's really going on to the game. I mean, it's one thing to just see the surface of the game, and that'll give you something for sure, and to know like, okay, this is good enough and you can play this way. But to really be able to execute it yourself, it's helpful to I think it's helpful to have actually, you know, worked through some variations like Bobby would have had to do. So bishop takes d5, hitting the queen. And I think queen b6 looks very good and quite forcing. Because we've got a threat here of rook e8 check, queen takes e8, queen c7 mate. And a secondary idea of pushing c6. So I think rook e8 is so powerful that black probably more or less has to try and take off the bishop to get control of c7. I suppose we should ask ourselves, what about bishop e7 defending rook e8s with the rook, and then c6, and we've answered our question, right? The queen gets pushed off. Actually, she comes here. And now it feels like I have to retreat, actually, like queen a5, if queen d4, queen c7 mate. So knight g3, queen d5. This knight needs to escape here, and then c7 should win. When you've got a pawn just blocking you like this, usually if you push it all the way, you'll just eventually be winning, because it splits up the opponent's camp, but if they ever take it, then you can get at the king. And you can often set up something like rook c1, queen d8 check using the pawn. And you set up like double check and checkmate kind of tactics. So I'm going to assume this position's winning. I'm threatening, you know, rook e7, knight c6, the queen's tied to the rook, the king can't move. Maybe queen f5 is a winning threat as well, sort of trying to force the king to take the pawn. So I'm going to assume that's winning and go back. Instead of bishop e7, we'll take this. Now I'm going to throw in c6 again, I think. And here, if the queen moves to, you know, a7 or c7, I have rook e8 checkmate. So the queen's got to stay on the checkmate. But if she goes here, then I have here. And I'm threatening to take the queen with check. Does she have anywhere else to go where she stops this checkmate and this checkmate? No. That's all the squares. So then black could take like this. You could take with the knight. I would guess rook c1 wins even more than knight c6. So that's what I'm going to put on the board for you all. And I'm going to assume that we can see here. White's down 2 pieces, but I think we can see that rook c6 is a winning threat, right? That's going to collect everything. Yeah. All right, so that I think that more or less does it. It's an example of the variations that one needs to do, right? Because, like, let's say you played a game like this and you had this position, you're like, yeah, you know, my big idea is c5, but when do I pull the trigger on c5? That would be like the big task that would be before you in a position like this, is sort of figuring out when and how do I pull the trigger on one of these plans, right? Do I play c5 with d5 hanging? Do I play b5 knight c6? And to do that, you would have to be able to calculate some variations where your opponent takes the pawn on d5, and you have to figure out if it's working for you or not. So yeah. All right, let me show you a couple other games now. I want to find... I want to find one more that I forgot to put in here. All right, got it. Okay. Luckily, I found it really fast. Sorry, everybody, there's no editing to fix that moment of me looking for it. So here's the game I played as black. Bishop g5, e6, f4, knight bd7. Normally, I played bishop e7 and b5 in this position. So this game here, I just played a new move out of the blue. Don't think I'd prepped it either at all. Just trying something. And this also shows that if you understand ideas, you can play positions, right? So this game here is not in the bishop c4 Najdorf like the Fischer game, right? And I'm not playing white, I'm playing black. But it's still a game guided by what I learned from Fischer, Rubinetti, right? So queen f3, queen c7, g4, b5, bishop f6, gf6, castles. And a huge question when playing these kind of positions as black is when to pull the trigger on b4. Anytime you do it, you know white's going to just move forward and sacrifice. But sometimes you have to force matters, because if you wait around and never do this, then at some point white plays f5, you play e5, and then their knight's going to come to d5, and then it's too late, right? So like if I played bishop c8, taking the bishop off of supporting this square, and white plays f5, and I can't hold this e6 square anymore, right? Like knight c5 takes and queen f6, and then e6 will fall as well, right? With the tempo on the rook and taking here. And if I go e5, and the knight, honestly, then my knight might just go to e6 here. Things are so brutally bad for black. But I don't want to give you guys like a calculation exercise to do. I just want to show you a position and say, now it's too late to ever play b4. The knight will always hop to d5, right? So there comes there always comes a point as black in these lines where you have to strongly consider whether or not you can afford to play b4 and give your opponent a free tempo to play this knight d5 attack that they're dying to play anyway. Okay, so here I did it. Played b4, knight d5 takes, bishop b7 is the follow-up. So now there's just a straight up threat from black to castle queenside. If black castles queenside, of course, white has sacked a piece without any good reason. So this makes the opponent give a check on the e-file. And any check they give on the e-file is actually going to take one of these pieces off of supporting d5, which is like a mildly weak point for white. Sometimes black counterattacks it, sometimes. So rook e1 was played. No bishop e7, knight f5, of course, so that unseats my king. Rook e1 check, king d8, queen e4, threatening checkmate here, queen c5. Giving the king the flight square to run and pressuring the d5 square. Right? My opponent plays bishop g2, defending this. And, you know, if you bring out this bishop to get your rook, then you invite the queen into e7 with check. She can, you know, start taking things, or playing knight e6 or knight c6 from there. So you have to time this stuff carefully, and often the most useful thing you can do is to run the king. Just like in Fischer Rubinetti, right? There's the moment where Bobby has just played c4. Right? Does black play bishop e7 or improve the queen or something? No. The best thing black does is just start running the king out of the way, because that has to happen. It's preserving the maximum flexibility there, right? So I've got that idea. Of course, Rubinetti played the move in sort of a losing position / situation. I played it in a perfectly okay situation, but it's still an application of the same idea. The king moves. Now I'm really threatening to take this pawn. With like knight to b6 next move. It's starting to come up. And the queen's movements are limited by the knight being undefended. If black goes knight c6, cutting me off from attacking this, then I won't spend my time. Then I may or may not spend my time attacking it. Sometimes you can still attack it, take, and then take the knight. But I might just use that time to instead develop the bishop, but that'll allow queen e7. Yeah, so here I think, I don't remember all the details, but I think maybe what you do here is you just take and play around it with your piece here. Okay, so we're at bishop g2, king c7. So the rook comes back to d1 to overprotect this pawn. Bishop h6, critical idea, knight f5, hitting the bishop, the rooks coordinate with the tempo on the queen, queen f3, and the bishop just comes back and defends the weak square. And this position, by this point, was winning for black, and I won the game in a couple more moves, actually quite quickly, by counterattacking. I didn't spend forever trying to. You see how bad this bishop is? You see how I lack space? So the plan here is actually to counterattack as black. So I'll show you the last couple moves just to show how we're playing. I mean, look at what an aggressive move. a5, now knight b6, putting pressure on here and looking at knight c4 or knight to a4. g5, rook c8. Right, white's taking apart my king side. I don't even resist. Just move the king out of the way. And here already my opponent resigned, because they're basically being asked to now take a very, very passive position. If the knight comes back to defend c2, I'm taking on d5. If the queen, well, the queen can't even retreat because I've got those squares covered. If the rook comes to c1, I can take here. So it's just a straight up counterattack from black against these points. You know, normal Sicilian play on the c file. And I knew from seeing these other games that it's not like you ever, well, it's very rare that black sort of fixes their king, coordinates all their pieces, and, you know, normally you have to counterattack tactically, and that's what happens. So that's another game that I got from Fischer Rubinetti that I was able to play from the black side of those d5 sacks. Let me show you another quick pair of games. So many years later, somebody played bishop b7 against me in a tournament again. But by this point, I knew Fischer, Rubinetti, and just overall my whole level of understanding of these positions had grown apace. On top of that, so I played rook e1, no bishop e7 because of bishop e6, right? And now you guys are going to get to see the queen b6 lines. Okay, so queen b6. Now, the idea here is to perhaps castle queenside, but more likely to play bishop e7 when the queen won't get tagged by knight e6. Okay, and I have seen games where played, I was honestly really traumatized to look in the database and see a ton of games by masters where basically players as white in positions like this, well, some of them played a3, not going for anything, just letting black, you know, finish up development, and some of them played lines like this. I mean, just ridiculous where it wasn't working. Like, what did they play? Like, they played like your queen d2, bishop e7, and then take or something, where the queen's not on d8, and it just doesn't work in the same way. So you really have to have some understanding. What's this move about, right? It's getting out of that tempo most of all. So here I was now, I think, mostly on my own. So I didn't specifically know this queen b6 move. I didn't know any opening theory beyond, you know, rook e1, bishop g5 was the Rubinetti game. So, but I found it on my own. a4, threatening this. Now, knight d5 is already playable for white. In almost all cases, if a4 is impactful, it's improved to have a4, b4 thrown in. And this game here is a very good example of that, because white's going to have the extra option of a5. Is actually a critical move in this line. So knight d5, takes, knight e5. Okay. So the idea here of my opponent is basically to give back the piece immediately. And I did not play f4. Adams also has a really cool game from this line where he doesn't play f4 either. If we play f4, then black's concept is to just castle queenside. Takes. We talked about, if you sack a piece, is it or is it not the ballast, right? Can black give it back? What's the idea of this version here from black? White sacked a piece for a pawn, black sacked a piece for everything. So black has to know that they're now down a pawn looking for compensation, right? Bishop c5. White's very, very weak on these diagonals. Bishop d6 and bishop c5, both interesting moves here. And I found one sort of GM level game in this line. White played c3, black played rook e8. This rook's going to be slow to come out. White's under some pressure on both of these squares. Full development for black. And yeah, a5, queen d6, rook e8, bishop f6, queen f6, queen g4, and then rook f1 was the game. White eventually won the game, but this position is basically unclear. You know, it's compensation. It's a two-way street. It's a plausible way for black to address this position. So when I saw this, I said, yeah, I'm not playing for f4. And I played a5. It's a very important move. We're going to drive the queen to a worse square. So queen c5, the best square, attacking d5, like in the game I just showed you where I was black, right? And I played queen c5 and put pressure on d5. But here, there's a very strong move from white, bishop e3. It's not obvious at all to block your own e-file, right? Like, it seems like you're looking to wind up and find the right time to play f4, and instead we now block that file. But there's a threat to essentially trap the black queen here with knight c6, queen here, and then bishop a4. So black doesn't have time to take this pawn and retreats the queen. I played bishop a4 check. And up to this point, this is also this Adam Sandler game, which at the time I played Adam Sadler game. Adam Sandler. I may have said Adam Sandler by brain slip. Michael Adams versus Matthew Sadler, two of the top British grandmasters of, you know, the 90s and 00s, and even today still probably. I didn't know that I was following that game, but Adams had an easy outing as white as well against Sadler playing king e7 against him. My opponent played king d8, and now we play f4. As soon as we're not actually winning the piece, right, or setting up a discovery or anything. But the idea is after knight c4 that, well, the idea is, first of all, black can't really sack this piece so well anymore, right, because their position is discoordinated. They'll still have the king running through the center of their board, and they won't have their extra piece. So you're going to kick the knight to g4 or c4, and it doesn't really matter which one they go to. And then you have knight check, bishop takes, bishop takes. We get into the c6 square and create an advantage over there. Black eliminates white's bishop. Very strong bishop here. And then is able to save the rook to a7. Queen d4. Rook c7. Unfortunate little detail from black. And queen here with checkmate. If instead black put the rook over on e7 to trade a rook, then white's able to gain the advantage by winning these two pawns and using the passed pawns on the queen side, while these two pieces are still cut off from defending over there. So there'd be no immediate win for white against rook e7, but a powerful position for white nonetheless, like rook here, bishop here, and then, you know, queen b6 check is what I intended during the game, but I think later on I found out that rook a4 would be even stronger in this position. And white finally gets the second pawn for the sacrifice. But importantly, this bishop that's set up here, we've got opposite colored bishops. Would be bad for winning the endgame, great for winning the middle game. We've got the black position kind of cut off. The rook can't get out. Black can't root out the bishop, and white has kind of a crushing position. I think during the game I was intending to play queen check, right, because it forces the queen here, and then just take this a pawn. And I thought I would just win pushing the a pawn. And I mean, I look at this now, I still think it. I don't know. I think also when I analyzed this game later on, I may have found out that there was some position where I had something even where I had some other improvement on what I did somewhere in here, like something like, I don't know, queen d4 instead of recapturing to come here. That doesn't make sense. I don't know what it could have been, but I feel like there was one other improvement. Anyway, white does seem to be winning fairly comfortably in these lines. The Adams game, in a sense, was even easier. He clearly had also seen Fischer Rubinetti, right? Because he's finding a5 and bishop a4 and bringing the bishop back. And then finally, you know, f4 with the king in the center. And Adams just had an easy stomping game here. Queen h5. Black can never take because the rook is open. Black can't take because it just brings more rooks for white. Played f6, bishop f2, which I think just sets up rook e5, and black can't really stop it. Black played g6, allowing it. If queen c7, presumably, you could just play bishop g3 and wind up for the sack anyway, right? Like bishop g3 and then take it. Maybe you could even go rook e5, and if the queen takes, you play rook e1 anyway, so you just completely don't care. And if takes here, then go here, here, and here, bringing every piece kind of Morphy style. I don't know. In any case, after bishop f2, this other game ended pretty quickly with g6. He took check, king here, queen f3. Let's see if I remember this game now. I won't look at the score of it. Queen f3. The knight moved out of the way for something or other here, but he's got check here, and then a beautiful move, knight f5. Yeah. The king has no squares, so you force him to take it and then check him back here and then switch which piece is on the diagonal, bishop instead of queen. I don't know which piece black blocked with, knight or bishop, but either way I know that Adams took with the rook, not the bishop, and black finally resigned. The king is completely slaughtered in this game as well. So from this one Fischer Rubinetti game, we get a sense of the signpost for when the sack on E6 is good enough or not good enough, when the sack on D5 is good enough or not good enough, right? Just having a couple positions that you can think to yourself, like you've got a signpost evaluation. This is a typical kind of sack on E6 position, and it is this evaluation. And then when you see any other version of it, you can say, is this better or worse than my signpost, right? Or my reference position, right? So this one here, playable for white. So if it's going to be several details in white's favor, it's going to be great. If there's going to be details in black's favor, white should stay away from it, right? Or when Fischer sacks on D5 with the bishop, knowing that if he didn't have B4, the position would be not good enough, but that B4 is enough. The second pawn and the mass, that's going to be enough. Also knowing like about how much you have to calculate. Also knowing that counterintuitively, there's a lot of lines where it's critical for black to counterattack the D5 pawn rather than just playing consolidating kind of moves. Having a sense of what kind of moves each player makes, when you have time for a retreating move or not, based on how much compensation you do or don't have, or how long-term or short-term it is. All those little signposts, I think, can very, very quickly guide you to playing these positions well, or at least much better, with either side. So, hope you enjoyed it. If you did or didn't, let me know with your feedback, and whether or not you currently play the Open Sicilian. I hope you feel encouraged that it is something that's possible to play. I think it's one of the scariest openings in all of chess to play. So I hope you feel somewhat encouraged that you could dabble in it now and then. If you want to, you can try it out. Yeah, just having a couple tools should maybe help with that confidence. All right, see you next time.